close your eyes. I mean it. No peeking. Close your eyes. I want you to remember the first place that was your home. Be there. See it. Now, all at once, your little feet are walking home, but nothing looks familiar. The streets have turned to lava. It's all flowing on, not holding still. The foundations and roads have been swept away, and all you have is your own footsteps on a new path. No permanence. Was there a time you were afraid you couldn't find your way home? And was there a time when you, or the outline of what you thought was you, dissolved? And suddenly you were part of a great expanse. I had that recurring dream as a child, and it came back to me not too long ago when I received a mysterious phone call. I'm a writer, and I often get calls from strangers who want to tell me their stories. This time, it was a man's voice, soft and melodic. He had a foreign accent I couldn't quite place. I'll call him Nick. His last name was Russian. I want you to help me find out who I am and where I came from, Nick said. I was a bit overworked that day and thought to myself, me too. There was murmuring about displaced persons, a mention of Tolstoy, torture by czars, a journey up a mountain, a mention of Gandhi. I didn't know what he was trying to tell me, and I told him I was too busy, and I hung up and forgot about him. Or I thought I forgot about him. Over the coming months, I had repeating dreams of Tolstoy, and also that original dream of flowing streets and searching for home. I realized I could no longer resist the story. Something was trying to show itself to me. The next thing I knew, I was standing at Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport, looking up at a TV screen. Fires raging, Aleppo, ancient places in ruins, Boston, black smoke, shattered limbs in the streets. All was quiet here for the moment. Snowden had come and gone. Back in America, Putin's Syria strategies were creating a ruckus, and I had taken on Nick's challenge. Being an outsider had some resonance with me. My own father had grown up in foster homes. And a friend at the UN had recently sent me a new report. There were now more displaced persons on the planet than any time in recent history. Amidst the shattered images, I wondered about containers of belief, safe harbors, and what ignites the world. As I passed customs, I started to doubt. How crazy was I to be pursuing a story I could barely wrap my mind around? It was hard enough being a writer in a world where books were no longer books. I have to admit, I envied Tolstoy. Just then, someone tapped me on the shoulder. I turned around, and a sturdy-looking man was holding out his hand to me. Maybe it was the jet lag, but suddenly I saw another hand 100 years ago, not too far from here, at Moscow's Petersburg Hotel. It was Tolstoy's hand. The KGB had been following him. He was meeting with 3 men from the Caucasus, dressed half as peasants, half as Cossacks. My hand was still being shaken, and I came back to the present. Your driver, the man said. My driver would soon take me 3.5 hours through the Russian countryside to the old Tolstoy estate known as Yasnaya Polyana. We'll get back to Moscow in a minute, but you're probably all wondering, well, what happened to Nick? Nick was back home, which was actually on a remote tropical island. When I first met him, he had one of his other drivers pick me up at a tiny airport in the tropical heat. From there, he drove me over some very rough terrain, up a long dirt road to the top of a mountain. The last part of the journey was almost impossible to navigate. Then again, another cloud of doubt came over me. Where was I? Was I crazy to be here? Almost at the top, from a distance, I saw a structure perched on the edge of a precipice. It looked like some kind of rare orchid more than a building. It had these organic-looking shoots reaching out as if to grasp the ungraspable, a series of flying buttress-like structures. We were headed straight for it. Soon I was stepping across one of those flying buttresses, and the driver had been replaced by a butler, dressed rather formally for this wild place. He put a large key in the door. When the door swung open, I gasped. "The soul always stands ajar," said Emily Dickinson. Those words came back to me when I first entered Nick's world. The room seemed to float in the sky, and it could barely be called a room. It only had 3 walls, and the 4th was an endless expanse of sea and sky. When I turned around, there was Nick, dressed in white trousers and a white shirt. He was in his 70s, tall and fair-skinned. He had white hair, and his voice was soft and somewhat melodic. Only the slightest hint of a Russian accent. He'd stopped speaking Russian when he was a boy. "Is that you?" he said. "I think so," I said. He shook my hand. "There are only 3 people in the world who know the story I'm about to tell you," he said. "We're recordless gypsies. It's a horrible state of affairs to be a man without a history. I feel terrible when I wake up in the morning." A wave of shame came over him. I soon learned he'd spent most of his childhood growing up in displaced persons camps. He was still wrestling with what happened. "We're known as pacifists and terrorists," he said. "Princely and lowly." Princely and lowly. Nick's grandfather had told him stories of sitting on Tolstoy's knee. From Nick's stories, I pictured the stately man with the tiny boy in his arms. That's Nick's grandfather, and that's Nick, the baby. From the time he was a tiny boy, Nick's grandfather had warned him, "Never tell anyone who you are, and never forget who you are." Was Nick really a prince? How did his family know Tolstoy? The czars had destroyed most of the records of his clan. Why? I can't forget one story of Nick's. One day, as a child in Canada, Nick went on his paper route. He was one of the lucky kids who wasn't put in schools behind barbed wire and taken away from their parents. That day, there was a headline on the front page: "Russian terrorists arrested for arson." One of the other boys stared at him and pointed to the headline and said, "You're a weirdo like them." Nick knew the group in the headlines as pacifists who burned arms in support of nonviolence. As the fires raged in the headlines, Nick made it to school. His classmates were reading aloud, one by one, from their history book. In it was a passage about his clan that had come to Canada from Russia. Would it fall on him to read the dreaded passage? Please stand. Stand up and read, his teacher says. He somehow rises up on his feet. His grandfather's words are in his head now. Never forget who you are, and never tell anyone who you are. He stands slowly, trembling. Panic is now coursing through his body. The terror and a flood pours over him. His own sweat. What is body? A sheath of flesh, pulsating, blood drained. He falls out of the body. There is no self, no Nick, only a wavering, trembling in the air. There are no words, no mouth to speak them. He tries to open the place where mouth is, and the roar of emptiness spews a tidal wave of silence. His teacher stares. What's wrong with you? He did not speak again for a year. That reminded me of the moment perhaps we've all experienced at one time or another, when your very core is in doubt. All you have left is a raw state of being. Emptiness and maybe even an impossible openness. How do you go on from there? As a writer, I experienced it in the journey of the book. What you thought you knew suddenly dissolves. And you have to keep listening closely to find out what's there. When I arrived at the Tolstoy estate, I walked the paths that Tolstoy had walked each day. What was the connection between Nick's grandfather and Tolstoy? Remember those 3 men in Moscow who met secretly with Tolstoy? I pictured it like this. After that meeting, Tolstoy comes back to his estate. He has visitors, including a boy who loves his stories. He sits on Tolstoy's knee, and they take walks together. As I stood there, I saw it all and wondered about that boy who walked with Tolstoy. Where was the boy's father? Had he brought him here? Did they somehow help Tolstoy with an idea he had after that meeting with the 3 men in Moscow? The world is on fire. What ignites it? Right now, there are 43 million people worldwide who've been uprooted by political oppression, violence, or war. On January 4th, 1899, the SS Lake Superior departed a Russian port for Canada. On it were thousands of passengers, including Nick's grandfather. Tolstoy used the royalties from his last book to ship them to Canada. They were living by his own beliefs and were known as the Doukhobors, or spirit wrestlers. They had their own religion of pacifism. Mahatma Gandhi, like Tolstoy, had been inspired by them. Tolstoy actually wrote to the Nobel Prize Committee and recommended that these Russian pacifists be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. When I was back with Nick, he was doubting again. Perhaps I'm a fraud, he said. Maybe my grandfather was a nut. Were his stories true? Were they true? Or had Nick's grandfather engaged in some kind of creative act? For a lifetime, Tolstoy had transfigured the struggles of his own life into fiction. Had Nick's grandfather pulled a Tolstoy? The facts lined up. His grandfather was on the boat, but had he really sat on Tolstoy's knee, been his companion? Maybe I'm a fraud, Nick said. If Nick was a fraud, then so was Tolstoy, and so is humanity. We reinvent ourselves from the ashes, the cracks in the story opening onto imagined vistas, creative vistas that build on the unknown. It's said, after all, that the unconscious does not distinguish between true and untrue stories. We're changed by those we believe to be true. I told Nick it was the Russian writer Lermontov who suggested in one of his novels that human beings can do nothing more than wander from doubt to doubt. Nick seemed to live from doubt to doubt. So did Tolstoy, as a matter of fact. And so, I realized, did I. Whether you're a scientist, a writer, or an artist, we're creating something from nothing, and in the process, discovering who we are. Perhaps all of us really are artists of self, and always a little displaced. Come with me, Nick said, before I left. He took me into a dimly lit room, and I knew there were going to be more surprises to the story. Horses, monkeys, dragons, sleeping dogs, all stared out at me, some in green jade, some in white. Then in the dusk, I saw it. Carved in a tiny piece of jade, 3 dragons entwined. They seemed to chase each other, trying to stay in the light. I traced the pieces of the story across continents. Now in a flash, it was right before me. The broken shards were part of a whole. From the ruins, Nick had made himself a prince. I finally understood the story. I gazed at the 3 dragons struggling to stay in the light. 3 dragons, history, the present, and one's own unfolding fate. How do we make ourselves up? Destiny had poured 3 eras of world history together, like the entwined dragons in a morsel of jade, into the figure of a single man.